Hello, thank you for joining the first Heartland Book Festival, a partnership between Missouri Humanities and the Kansas City Public Library. We are excited to showcase the diverse talents of local, regional, and national writers, scholars, artists, and performers. We hope you enjoy your time at the festival and find your story along the way. The festival budget is fully funded by grants and gifts. Thank you to our generous sponsors who have helped us provide free access to all public festival activities. You can find a list of sponsors in your festival guide, and if you would like to support the festival, you can go to www.heartlandbookfest.org/donate. Also in the festival guide and on signs, actually let's disregard that. Also in your festival guide, there is a QR code for a short survey. Please complete the survey to tell us about your experience. You can wait up until the end. That will help the planning committee build out next year's festival. I am beyond thrilled to introduce best-selling American crime writer and acclaimed storyteller, Karin Slaughter. You can go ahead and make some noise. She is the author of more than 20 instant New York Times best-selling novels. She's published in 120 countries with more than 40 million copies sold across the globe. Slaughter's work have spawned 2 streaming television series, Netflix Pieces of Her, you can snap if you watch any of these shows, let us know, and the ABC police procedural Will Trent. She is an avid supporter of libraries, and as our keynote presenter, she'll discuss the latest book in her wildly successful Will Trent series, After That Night, which everyone in this room has received a complimentary copy along with an autographed book plate made possible by the generous support of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. All right, without further ado, let's make some noise for Karin Slaughter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Usually I like to tell you what to expect. I've been told I can talk about anything. So there's going to be a little interpretive dance maybe later on and all that kind of stuff. Talk about my cats. If you're on my Facebook page, you know they're very important to me. Actually, I was talking to a friend whose kid was sick, and I was like, I just can't imagine what I'd do if that happened to my cat. And she hung up on me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about libraries, because I love libraries. I'm a Southerner, so I'm going to make fun of my family a lot. And I'm going to encourage you to support this library or whatever libraries in your hometown, and I'll talk a little bit about the books, and then I'll let you guys ask me questions. So if nobody has any questions, I'll randomly call on people. So you better hope somebody stands up. So normally I just talk out of my ass. But since this is for libraries, and libraries are in such a precarious situation right now, and being politicized when they're not political entities. The wonderful thing about libraries is there's no politics. They're open to everyone. They serve their communities. Librarians live in their communities. They know their communities. And the fact that, according to recent research, 11 people are responsible for 60% of the challenges of books in libraries right now. We are not going to let this tyranny of the minority control us. And while I love libraries, and I think they're wonderful, one of the really great things about libraries is if you don't like what's there, you don't have to go. So I would encourage those people to just stay home. So this is going to be the start of my well-prepared speech, and then you'll know when I'm off the cue cards because it's going to ramble a lot. Nancy Drew, an attractive girl of 18, was driving along a country road in her new dark blue convertible. Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret. We're moving today. I'm so scared, God. I've never lived anywhere but here. Of all Bernice's conversations, perhaps the best known and most universally approved was a line about bobbing her hair. You see, there's this old chifferobe in the yard Papa had brought in to chop up for kindling. She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every single minute of her life. They're not going to lick me if I have to lie, steal, cheat, or kill, as God is my witness. I'll never be hungry again. These 6 passages are from some of my favorite books growing up, and they tell you more about who I am as a person than any interview I've ever given. And what do they have in common? They were all recommended to me by my local Jonesboro, Georgia librarians. And these women changed my life. You know, I was living in a small southern town, past where Jesus lost his sandals, as my grandmother used to say. And everywhere I looked, my role models were the same type of guy as my dad. And my dad's a great guy, but, you know, representation really matters. And in the library, these women were the bosses of the library. And as a little girl, seeing women having some respect and control and power was really amazing to me. And to learn that they did that through a love of reading, which is something that I experienced from a very early age, was miraculous to me. And one of the lines I read is from Flannery O'Connor. And I remember when I first read Flannery O'Connor, and up until that point, I had always known I wanted to be a writer. That was something I was very clear on. When I was in kindergarten, it was something, you know, all kindergarten teachers ask it. Now we know they're looking for ideas, but they say, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I remember my first event I did near my hometown. This woman came up to me, and she said, do you remember me from kindergarten? And usually, you know, it's from high school, and you're like, well, there's a reason why we lost touch. But kindergarten, there's no way, because we've changed a lot since then. And she said, I remember you, because when the teacher asked us what we wanted to do for a living, you and I are the only ones who are doing now what we wanted to do then. And I said, well, how do you know? And she's like, well, I kept track of everybody. I still live there. I follow everybody. And I said, that's amazing. And she said, yeah, you wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be divorced from a very wealthy man. And arguably, she was more successful. She did it twice. Only one of us left on a private jet that day. But that's how important the library was for me, because I was a profoundly strange little girl. I was interested in very dark things. I'm the youngest of 3 girls. I wrote my first book when I was 6 years old, and it was about my sisters being murdered. Every single one of my stories from my early work was about them being mutilated or kidnapped, and it was more magical realism. There wasn't a narrative arc. It was more like the happy ending was I was an only child. And my dad loved these, and he always gave me a quarter every time I told a new one. So from an early age, I was incentivized to write the sorts of books I write. But the librarian who gave me Flannery O'Connor, she knew me. I had grown up in this library with her, and she knew what I would love, and she put this in my hands, and she said, turn to the back. And there was this whole explanation of who Flannery O'Connor was. And she was this very profoundly strange little girl. I mean, at a very young age, one of her claims to fame was she taught a chicken how to walk backward. And she was in the newspaper for that, because that's a big thing in Milledgeville. And she wrote these stories, and she was celebrated all around the world for it. And I thought, my first thought was, you jerks, because everybody in town had just thought I was really weird, and they're very worried I would never get married, which, surprise. But it was all about, well, if only you would not write these dark things. If only you would not be interested in these dark things. And, like there was this magic to being a perfect person, and it was to be everything I was not. And to have Flannery O'Connor and read her stories and see this is a really strange woman who is doing very well being strange, that was a huge thing for me. And so I'm very grateful for the librarians who gave me those books. And a lot of times it's weird because people will come up to me and they'll go, oh, I'm sorry, I got your book in the library. So I want to say libraries do buy books, right? They don't steal them. It's not like your teachers who live in the basement of the school. Like, they really do. It's a legitimate business, right? But so how many people here listened to your parents when you grew up? Like, that was a big thing? Okay. And how many of you listened to books? Exactly. And so these books just opened up a new world for me. I had never traveled. I had never been anywhere. I mean, we didn't go to Atlanta because it was scary. And, if we went to a Braves game, it had to be during the daytime. And it was just really eye-opening to see these different worlds and these different experiences and cultures and all of that through reading. And my father was one of the biggest champions of me reading books. Initially, we had the bookmobile. You guys have bookmobiles here, 3 of them. Who go around and reach out to people who can't otherwise come in. But for me, it was a wonderful treat every month when that bus would pull up with the books on the shelves. And, unfortunately, the woman who drove the bookmobile was also our school bus driver. And because my sisters are such hateful people, by the time I got onto that bus as a student, she looked at me and she's like, you're sitting in the front row and you're on silent bus until you get kicked out or graduate. Which was probably fair in retrospect, considering my family name. But they didn't like reading, and they would do things like they would they'd dog ear my books, and they would, if they saw I had a bookmark, they would take them out. I mean, they were like Disney level villains here with books. But my dad loved that I loved reading, and he would make sure that I could go to the bookmobile. He would make sure that when we got the permanent library in town, every Saturday before work, he would drop me off there, and then he would pick me up. And reading was not something that was ever introduced in his life as a child, because his family, they were sharecroppers. They were dirt poor. They lived in shacks that they squatted in. And when the owner came and found out they were living there, they'd have to move on, and they would take the floorboards with them because they didn't want to have to sleep on the dirt in the next place. And my dad had 8 brothers and sisters, so a lot of kids, a lot of them eating squirrels, just so that they would have something to eat for dinner. And I should say my grandfather was there, but he was an absolutely horrible person. It's universally agreed in my family that he was a horrible person. If you want to know how bad he was, he got kicked out of the Klan for not taking care of his family. I mean, who knew they had any standards? But apparently that's one, and my grandfather could not meet it. And, consequently, my father had a very difficult childhood. And so being able to give me this life of reading was very important to him. But my grandmother was also a closet reader. If in her family, if you could just point to a book and say, I read that, people would not be impressed. It's like, did you use that flour bag to make some underwear? Yes, that's impressive. Did you pick a bunch of cotton? Yes, that's impressive. But I read this book was not something you would hang your hat on. But the one thing she loved most of all was something called True Crime Magazine. And I see some nods. This is snuff porn, right? I mean, it's awful. And my grandmother religiously read this magazine. And I mean religious in the perfect sense, because every Sunday after church, she would go to the Piggly Wiggly on the bad side of town to get this magazine. And then she would go to the Kroger, which was on the good side of town, to get food. And then she would cook our Sunday dinner, and she would read this magazine while she was cooking Sunday dinner. And when we would pull up, she would hide this magazine under her chest of drawers in her bedroom. And I know that because that is where we would go immediately. And these stories are awful. I mean, and they always had, like, the last line was, her father was right, or she should have listened to her husband, right? I mean, it was all about punishing women for having fun. I mean, I'm surprised that we didn't, like, worry there's going to be a hook on our door. But we would cry every Sunday night, and our parents were like, wow, whatever the pastor said really got to them. Maybe they're going to be good now. It's like, no, we just were afraid we were going to be murdered. So that was something my grandmother loved doing. And I remember one Christmas, if you have a Southern grandmother, you know they're very hard to please. Like one year my dad bought my grandmother a frying pan, and she found out how much it cost, and she wouldn't use it because it was too expensive. So she put it on the wall like it was art. And when she passed away, we found all these hats, these beautiful hats she would never wear because they were too nice to wear in her closet. And so one Christmas, I had the great idea, let's get her true crime magazine. You know, she'll love that. She gets it every Sunday. Let's get this for her. We'll get her a subscription. She won't have to go to the Piggly Wiggly. You know, it'll save her some time. And so Sunday morning came, and we're all sitting at the breakfast table. And my dad had a rule that you could not open presents until he finished breakfast, because he was a sadist. And so finally, because I was the youngest, so of course I'm like the Aaron Brockovich of the family, right? The truth sayer. I'm like, Grandma, we got you True Crime Magazine. We got you a subscription so you don't have to go to Piggly Wiggly. And there was complete silence. And she burst into tears. And she put her head in her hands. And she said, I do not want the postman to know I read that. And so my dad, like, the next business day, had to call and cancel the subscription. And they charged him to cancel it. So I think this was something that happened a lot with, like, grandmothers being like, I can't have that. Pornography, right? So I stand up here and I think about what I write, and I know that my grandmother would just be so disgusted by what I'm doing, and that it's so shameful. But I have my father to thank for giving me that start. I don't know any writers, from the most successful to, you know, in the stratosphere, who do not love libraries. We all love libraries. We all got our start there. You know, it was really just an opportunity to have some escape. Most writers are very unusual children, and it's not by choice. And to have this outlet is something that is amazing. And it's not just for the weird kids. I mean, I know I'm going to represent for the weirdos out there. But it's so important to have access to all kinds of books. And, of course, I love the classics like V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic, Thornbirds, another classic, Lace. Which one of you bitches is my mother? I mean, who doesn't know that classic line from literature? But, you know, let's talk about why reading is important. Because you don't need it to survive, technically. I mean, a lot of us think we do. And a lot of us think that we would die if we didn't have another book. And I'm looking at these people, we're all reading the cereal boxes in the morning, and, you know, you just have to read something. One thing that really worries me is the class divide, because wealthy kids are reading books. Wealthy kids are reading classics. They're going to private schools that prepare them with all the AP curricula, because their parents have a lot of money, they expect them to get the best, and they are going to go to the top-tier schools. And so crippling a library is the fastest way to deprive children of that opportunity. And I say this as someone who was a really horrible student and got most of my education from reading books. And not that I didn't have fantastic teachers. I mean, my first book is dedicated to my 9th grade teacher, who was just a wonderful, wonderful influence on me. But it's very important that we make sure every child has this kind of access, because if you look at people in our society who excel and who do well, and, you know, we're not like a lot of other countries where there's this firm class system. You get entree through reading, through intelligence, through the arts, through sport, through all these different things in ways that other countries don't have. And we are crippling opportunity when we stop letting libraries give books to their communities that the communities want. The other thing I will say, about reading in libraries is it's important because children are incredibly selfish. And I say this as someone who doesn't like children. I don't understand why they're sticky. They have poor motor control. They're not very interesting. I mean, we can all admit that. But reading stories tells them there's a world outside themselves. You know, it tells them there are different cultures, that the language they are learning at home is key to unlocking the mysteries of the greater world. And we also know from decades of science and experimenting on children, back when you could, that children who read develop pathways in their brains that they will not develop absent being fluent in reading. And so there's a finite amount of time where we have these children where they can turn themselves into critical thinkers. And they can start that by being at the library. Harold has a purple crayon? What the hell? I have a purple crayon. You know, I'm not the only kid in the world with a purple crayon. Maybe I shouldn't be so selfish, right? It teaches us cognitive skills. I mean, is it any wonder a lot of politicians don't want kids to be capable of critical thinking and asking questions and saying, why are my tax dollars going to this? And why, you know, what's the statistical breakdown on this? Why are 11 people telling me I can read something or can't read something? So it trains your mind to question what you're told, which is why the first thing dictators do when they get to office is ban books. It's a hallmark of closed societies, and it really strangles off innovation. It strangles off all the things, particularly in America, we're known for. It's a couple of guys in their garage saying, we're going to build this, or a woman saying, you know what, I'm going to go back to school, I'm going to go to medical school, it's something that gives us a character as a nation that sets us off from a lot of other nations, because we have this idea of the American dream and opportunity and all this stuff that we lose without the library. So that's primarily why I think it's important for us to support libraries. But if you think about the fact that in other countries, a girl walking to school will get acid thrown in her face. I mean, that's a privilege we have, and it's a very fleeting privilege that we could lose. Or, you know, why it was illegal prior to the Civil War to teach enslaved people how to read. And that was a control mechanism. A lot of censorship is actually control in disguise. And you have to wonder, what are they trying to control? Well, they're trying to control their base of power. And we don't want that. The vast majority of people in the United States, and it's not just the United States, it's happening everywhere. I was just in Europe for my book tours there. I was in 5 different countries. They're all having people do the same things we're doing. And it's not the internet. It's just there's always going to be a small percentage of the population that wants to control the other. And, you know, one of the books I read in the library, or it was a short story, Young Goodman Brown, I think, talks about that, how, you know, this is a guy who lives in a community that's very puritanical, and he is subject to all these laws and all these rules, and then he goes in the woods, and all the people who make the laws and the rule makers are basically having an orgy. Well, that's what's happening. I mean, I know they call it Washington, D.C., but but we need to be aware that people who don't care about us are trying to set guidelines and laws that control our lives. And again, cutting funding from libraries, telling people you can't read this, you can't read that. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I got in the car, when I got home, my dad would pick me up to take me home from the library, he looked at every single book I was reading. And he would say, this seems a little old for you, so if you have any questions, let me know and we'll talk about it, which is how I learned that incest is wrong in Flowers in the Attic. But I still loved it anyway. I still loved it. It's still wonderful. I even watched the recent movie. But if you read, and you read various things, it's not just about enjoyment. You learn how to explicate text. What are they really trying to say? You know, one of the wonderful things about O'Connor, and I'm not a particularly religious person, unless he's listening, then yes. But you have to understand Catholicism to understand O'Connor. You have to understand the Gilded Age, the class structure, to understand Edith Wharton. You have to read her daughter's work, Vindication of the Rights of Women. You have to understand not her daughter, I'm sorry, Wollstonecraft's, you have to understand what's going on in society that would make women so angry. And I would say, look around, because it's still happening. But at a very basic level, we all want kids to read, because if they do well in school, it's cheaper for us. We spend less money on policing. We spend less money on support. There's so many tax savings by having children have access to reading. And if they do love reading, they'll do better in school. They're more likely to go to college. They're more likely to graduate with a high-paying job, and they're more likely to pay higher taxes. So this is why every dollar you spend in a library as a community returns $4 to you. I mean, that is a really good investment, and it's not like a Madoff investment. I mean, it's like a legitimate investment. There's also, and this is true everywhere in the United States, but particularly in Georgia, 80% of children in rural communities can only access books and technology at the local library. We saw this during the height of the pandemic. They were saying virtual learning. Well, that's great if you go to Snotley's School of Learning, right? But if you're a kid on a farm in a rural community, your internet is still dial-up. A lot of people are still on dial-up. A lot of people are still using satellite hookups, and they're very slow. And so we're leaving children even further behind. But libraries stepped up. They created hotspots. They had buses go out to pockets of areas in Georgia where kids were 40 miles from the library, and the kids would ride their bikes there and sit outside, or they could sit on the bus, and there was a Wi-Fi hotspot for them to be able to access school and do homework. A lot of children, their only access to the internet is through their parents' phones, which as a parent would be very annoying to me because I got Bubble Witch to play. So our libraries invested in technology. We had laptops, we had phones, we had iPads, we had all these things that kids could check out. And it pulled them into the world, because isolation is what is so negative to children. And I know there was a lot of controversy about virtual schooling and all that, but those kids did not do as poorly as kids who were 100 miles from the closest contact, who relied on school for their social interaction, who relied on it for food. And we had our local library, and I'm saying local, I'm in Atlanta, but I'm in actually the DeKalb County, not the Fulton County part, which everybody knows DeKalb County. Thanks a lot, elections. But they're also saying it correctly instead of DeKalb, which is great. But we had libraries who were actually feeding children because they didn't have access to food. And, you kind of need food for your brain to work. I'll just say that. There's a reason they call it hangry. So as usual, librarians are on the front lines. Your librarians here at this library, your state librarian, they're on the front lines. And their bosses are only hearing from those 11 people. They need to hear from you. Because the problem with us as consumers is if we're happy, we say thank you to who's ever in front of us. We don't think, I need to call the Secretary of State and say, I love my library. I want you to fund my library. It gives me a wonderful enrichment. It's part of my life. It's part of my community. I mean, you have such a beautiful facility here. I know you have other branches. I know you've got another giant branch and some smaller ones. And so I would really encourage you, if you have some time, to call your Secretary of State and say, look, stop screwing around with the library. It's for all of us. And all of us, except for these 11 people, want these libraries open. We want them funded. It's such a small investment and gives such a big reward, not least of all because you can leave your kids here. So what have I done to help libraries? Well, I have a fund that I have called Save the Libraries. I started out doing fundraisers. What I quickly learned is when libraries do fundraisers, they basically pay for themselves. So what I said to a bunch of friends of mine, Catherine Stockett, who wrote The Help, and is currently living the best life in Tahiti, and Mary Kay Andrews, another Atlanta author, and I, we kind of adopted our local library system, and we did what we could for them. And we said, instead of doing a fundraiser, let's just give you money, because that's what they need. They need money. And I know you pay taxes and all that, but you also pay a lot of extra money for things that you want. And believe me, you want kids who are readers and who are in the libraries and not up to other mischief, because it's a slippery slope. We did another event for the Boston Public Library. We had Lee Child, Tess Gerritsen, Charlene Harris. And again, when I say that authors love libraries, this was my pitch to all these authors. We want to go to these libraries and do a fundraiser, but no one is going to pay for your hotel or your flight, and you need to figure out how you're going to get from the airport and back to the airport. And they were like, okay, it's for the library. And so we did that. And we kept doing that until we thought, you know, I'd just rather stay home. And so we started writing checks for them and supporting our local system. And to date, Save the Libraries has raised over $500,000 for libraries. And 100% of that has gone into libraries. Ferguson stayed open when all of that was happening. The library stayed open. Children need a place to go. Children need consistency, and they need structure. And the library offered that for them at a time that was very unstable feeling for children. And we've supported libraries around the world. Some are in England. It was funny, in France, I was talking about this, and they're like, well, I don't understand. Why don't you just raise taxes? They have beautiful libraries there, no problems. So that's also an option. But what I said when I started this was, I will do everything I can in my limited power, and considering that I love to stay at home, to help libraries. So that's why I'm here. I'm here to tell you that you are lucky to have this, that I have been all over the world. I've seen some beautiful libraries. I've seen some libraries that are closing. And as a very strange little girl who grew up to be an even stranger adult, I promise that I'll keep helping kids as long as I can, and as long as I don't have to talk to them or see them. But I know there are a lot of librarians in the room, so, and this is a bastardizing of a Virginia Woolf quote, which all the librarians will know I'm stealing it from her, so I wanted to cop to that. But it hopefully applies to you guys too. So when the day of judgment dawns and all the librarians approach the gates of heaven with books under their arms, the Almighty will turn to Peter and say, look, these need no reward. We have nothing to give them. They have loved reading. So keep loving reading. That's what you can do. So now I'm going to talk, if anybody's interested in Will Trent, I'll talk a little bit about that. Let's see how much time I've got time. I've been writing for many years, and you know, I've always loved writing. I'm not making that up when I said at 6 years old I was writing these stories. And, you know, I do write very unflinchingly about things. And that's important to me, because one thing I alluded to was that my grandfather was a horrible person. And he was incredibly abusive toward my grandmother. And when I was growing up and we would do these Sunday lunches, you know, I was just in my stupid kid head, and I didn't notice things like that she had a black eye or a cut lip. And then when my uncles would tease her about being clumsy, I would tease her too, because I thought she's clumsy. That's how she broke her arm. You know, that's how she broke the bones in her face. And eventually I realized that wasn't what was happening. It was my grandfather. And I realized around the age of 12 or 13 that our silence was not helping her. It was only helping him. And that was a very pivotal moment in my life, because I talked about my 9th grade English teacher and how important she was to me. One of the first things she said to me was, "You're a very good writer." And I'd heard that all my life, so I was like, yes, I know. And she said, "But you could be better." And I was like, what now? And she challenged me, and she talked to me about language as a tool, about how speaking things that people don't talk about can have such power, and it can help change things. And that put it in my head at a very early age that it's okay to talk about things that people aren't talking about. and that if you do talk about it, you're not making it happen more. I mean, God, if I could write books where everybody was returning their grocery carts at the store, it would be Cart season 12, right? But I understood finally, I made that connection that these books that I was reading that had such a huge impact on me, I could do that. I could try that. And she's the reason I did that. And my grandmother is the other reason I decided to write these stories, which was very alarming to have from a 13-year-old girl. And there were many, many visits to the principal's office on my father's behalf where they were saying, well, did you see what she wrote? And my dad was like, it was hilarious. Because they were a little funny. And I remember, my dad was always called up to the principal's office. And my 11th grade year, so I had already been in trouble because I thought I was making a statement on beauty by taping a picture of Marilyn Monroe after the autopsy on the side of my lunchbox. It's a statement, right? So that was principal's office. And then, everybody had those baby on board. And I was like, wouldn't it be funny to put dead baby on board? And they're like, after they searched my car, principal's office. And so my dad got called up. And he was like, well, hey, Chuck, because they knew each other really well. My dad had his own parking space, basically. And they said, this is what she's done. And he's like, did you find a dead baby? And no. And he said, Chuck, I'm just going to say this once. She's weird. We love her, but she's weird. And don't call me up here for this shit anymore. And that gave me permission to keep writing these stories. And it made me kind of embrace who I am. And when I first started, CSI was just coming on. And I would have all these particularly young women come up and say, oh, I watch CSI. It reminded me of my grandmother, like, I don't want the mailman to know I'm reading this, right? And now it's so wonderful that people are like, I love this stuff because I'm surrounded by people who are as strange as me. And that's why it's been such a joy to have the evolution of writing the Grant County books, which I wrote 6 of those, and then to start the Will Trent series, and to see the television show adapted and have more people engage with it and seeing different stories told using these characters. But for me, I always think about my grandmother when I start a book, and I think about how horrified she would be, but I also think about how horrified I was when I realized what was really going on. And so this latest book, After That Night, is about sexual assault. Don't worry, there's like chihuahuas and there's some fun stuff and there's a mystery and all that. But I thought it felt like a good time to tell Sarah's story, which I talked about, this had happened to her. She'd been sexually assaulted in medical school when she was in Atlanta. I talked about that in the first book. And I always knew I would come back to that when I had the right time, right place, when the story felt like it could be told. And one of the things I just had to get past angry, because no one wants to listen to an angry woman, as my grandmother used to say, probably because she got the hell knocked out of her every time she tried to express it. But I really felt like this was a good time to tell Sarah's story. And coming off the success of the TV show, you might think, what a marketing genius Karin Slaughter is. She's got a Will Trent TV show, and there's billboards everywhere. ABC and Hulu are spending millions of dollars promoting Will Trent, Will Trent. And so her next book is about Sarah Linton, who's not even in the show yet. So yeah, there was that conversation. But I'm at this point in my career where I can just write whatever I want to write. And so I felt really fortunate that my publisher was really behind this book. And don't worry, Sarah will eventually be in the Will Trent series. But keep in mind, she wasn't in the first 2 books. It had to get to a place. And so it's kind of Sarah's story. Will is there, of course, because he's the most important man in her life, and so he has to be there. But it starts off with Sarah when she first moved back to Atlanta 3 years prior to the present day. And she's kind of flirting with this guy, Will Trent, who has no game. Then we fast forward and we catch up with them in the present day. And they try to figure out what's going on because Sarah, in that past episode, she had a patient come in and something really bad had happened to this patient. And she promised this woman, this young woman, that she would figure out what happened and she would bring whoever did this to her to justice. And so it's sort of Sarah's quest. And it has one of the sexiest lines in it, I think, that Will Trent has ever said, which is he says to Sarah, "Tell me what you need." And then he does it. Yeah. So you can look for that. But I love this story. I love writing these characters. I was talking to one of your supporters, your library supporters, earlier about Sarah and how she's grown through the Grant County series. And I made a joke, but this is true, that when I started writing Sarah Linton, I knew that she would get older as I got older. I didn't realize we'd get this old. Very surprised. Talk about a twist ending, right? Well, hopefully not the ending. But I wanted her to change, you know, and then when you meet her in Blindsided, the first book, she's very black and white about right and wrong. And then all this bad stuff starts happening, and she's affected by it personally, and that changes her. And that's very deliberate, because I think about how the crime of domestic violence affected my family and how it changed the perception that each of us had about women's roles in society, what's acceptable, what's considered a crime and what's not a crime, and who's a victim and who's not a victim, right? Because when someone is victimized and she's a woman, we have all kinds of criteria before we'll feel sorry for her, right? So, you know, if she was drinking or anything like that, no, we're not going to feel sorry for her. If she's a white pregnant woman, you know, that's like the gold standard. People magazine is like dying for that, right? And I wanted to talk about those disparities, and I wanted to talk about the awful things that women do to other women. You know, we put a lot of focus on women and blaming women, and we should just accept that, you know, a lot of men will say, I didn't realize how bad it was for women until I had a daughter, right? Oh, I didn't realize rape was bad until I had a wife. You know, it's like with women, we think about people who commit the crime of sexual assault as these bad guys. And they are husbands, they are brothers, they are uncles. Generally, they're someone the woman knows. Statistically, they're most likely to be someone in her social circle or in her familial circle. And that's something we don't really accept. It's a crime that happens to 250,000 women every year, according to the FBI. And we know those statistics are off. We know every police department doesn't report to the FBI. We know every woman doesn't report when this happens. And so a lot of times we just, as a society, kind of ignore it, you know, and it's too squishy, and we don't want to think about it, and we don't want to have someone who we think of as a hero. Suddenly we learn they're doing this bad stuff, and we want to put blame somewhere, and the woman is generally the one who gets the blame. And I thought it was a really important time to talk about that in the book. And again, there's lots of positive stuff. There's sex and chihuahuas and, you know, all this kind of stuff. But there's also that message if you're looking for it. And that's, if you've read a lot of my books, you know that's something that's been very important to me from the beginning, is to talk in an unflinching way about the violence that is out there and how it can impact some of the weakest among us. You know, it's happening to children, it's happening to men, it's happening everywhere. And to me, it felt like a good time to talk about it. But now I think I'm going to have to let you guys ask me some questions. Ask me how I know. So am I going to have to call on somebody, or is somebody going to come up to the microphone? Yeah?
I'm never shy.
Okay, good.
I just want to tell you, again, I mentioned when we were having lunch just before this that if I look tired, it's because of Karin. I'm the next, one more page, one more chapter, one more book. Nope, it's time to go to bed. So I have to give you that. You kept me up a few nights reading the book.
Thank you.
But I just wanted to say, too, I'm impressed, and this is my first read of yours, so I have obviously a lot to catch up on. But your book focuses on so many things that are of current. You know, of course, the Me Too movement. As you discussed, there's also the two-party system of justice, if you would. The if you have the money, you have the good attorneys and you get the things, that type of stuff. Do you try to, and again, because I haven't read, I know there's some people here obviously have read a lot of her books and I'm looking forward to it. Do you try to focus on some of the things that are happening in our current events and pulling those into your most recent books each time? Or does this one just happen to be?
Not current events. I mean, the Me Too movement, I mean, I think is wonderful. We had about 10 minutes of it before people were like, what about men? But I don't, you know, it's weird because when a lot of people have an opinion on something, we call it political. And I don't think it should be political to say rape is a really bad thing. And I don't think it should be political to say women should get paid for the jobs they're doing and all these other things. And it's sort of like woke. It's become a catch-all for stuff I don't like, right? And so I think that it's been a part of my work, but not by design. And never, ever in a way that would interrupt story. Because I think it's really important to try, if there's a side that, I mean, like, rape is bad. There's not another side to that, right? Nazis, bad. Not another side to that. So I don't try to do both sides on things that are clearly awful things, but I want to put it in context so we understand what happens to people. And one of the reasons I want to tell Sarah's story now is we hear about these crimes, but we never hear what happens next. And rape is usually a very brief crime, right? It doesn't last that long. It's a moment in time, but it's akin to a murder because it changes a man or a woman's life, because it does happen to men, and it's not just the prison rape jokes. This is a real crime that happens to men. It changes their lives forever. The person they were, who was comfortable in their body, is no longer there. And so I thought it was really important to write about, okay, well, we read a lot of books where this happens. What happens next?
Could you talk a bit about the research that you have to do that goes into your works? I'm thinking particularly of dyslexia, that topic, and everything that goes along with that. Thank you.
Well, I love the research. I mean, I'm sure there's some writers in the room who tell you that they could just research for a living because it's fun, but then you have to figure out how to put it in there. I research all the sex myself. I don't job anything out. Feel very strongly about that. And so now I'll talk about dyslexia. This is something in my family, and so I have firsthand knowledge about it. And my sister had it. So when we were growing up, we didn't really have the support for people with disabilities that we do now. Thanks to Bush Sr. for signing the Americans with Disability Act, we do. But she was just called stupid and lazy. And that's something that a lot of kids with learning disabilities get labeled with. And it can be so damaging. And I wanted to talk about that. And I wanted to talk about it through a character who was the hero. And to show it as something that is a part of his personality but doesn't define his personality. You know, he's a very good detective in a lot of ways because he notices things that other people don't notice. And he's doing this because he has to pick up on different cues than someone who is a more fluent reader. He can read, just not fluently.
I guess I don't really have a question, but my daughter, she has cerebral palsy, and I think I just needed to hear this today because I've been struggling deciding if I should send her to school because she's still like a baby. She's turning 3 in January, so she's going to go to Head Start. I'm just super nervous, so thank you for coming here today.
Thank you. Good luck to you.
First of all, I'm fangirling. Second, thank you. Thank you for writing flawed characters. I think that you really bring the worst of all of us forward. I'm weird too. So 2 questions. You're a cat person. I love your cat or day posts. Why do all of your characters have dogs? And second, are we going to see more Andy books, the Andrea books?
Andy from Pieces of Her.
Yes.
I would hope so. I have to have the right story for her. I really enjoyed Girl Forgotten, and I'd like to do some more with that. And the marshals are amazing, and they get to do really cool things. So hanging out with marshals is great research. So I would absolutely love to do that and get more into that character. So that's definitely on my to-do list. Cats, yes. You know, cats are kind of jerks. And they're not very useful for propelling a narrative. I mean, it's like, we got to solve a crime. Oh, no, we got to clip crap out of the cat's feathers, right? Oh, no, I'm rushing out the door to solve this. I'm slipping on cat puke. You know, it's just, they don't really work and Sneaky Pie, I'm not going to, like, throw any shade, but this cat is not believable, right? I mean, one, it talks. But two, you know, cats don't care about crime. If a crime's committed, they're going to be the ones doing it, right? So that's part of the reason, is because I've just spent like a great deal of time talking about cats, and I'm easily distracted by that because I love them so much. But yeah, maybe eventually. Sarah doesn't know that Will has been feeding some stray cats, but she's going to find out. Yeah.
So my favorite book by you is Pretty Girls. I just love it. The way you write about grief in that book has like completely changed the way that I look at it completely. But what I want to ask about is the way that you write about family dynamics. And we find out kind of little pieces and secrets about the backstories of people. I mean, I know you wrote about murdering your sisters when you were 6, but do you ever, as you uncover those family dynamics when you write, do you ever hate your characters, even your heroines?
No, because I see a little bit of myself in all of them, and I don't really hate myself. I mean, I can be a little scamp, don't get me wrong. And those murders were alleged, right? It's very mysterious that they both died within a week of each other. But I do love, and what I love about it as being the youngest kid, I get the last word, right? So I get to put words in their mouths and my mouth, and it's like, yeah, I'm going to be the coolest one. And I'm going to have the last word, and I'm going to be like the one people root for. So anytime you see that, a sister dynamic, I'm the sister that's like the badass, and my other sister's the one falling apart. But I do love that. And it's interesting because many years ago, I met a bookseller in South Georgia who was just like an amazing woman. And I'd found out that during World War II, to raise money for the troops, she swam across the English Channel. And I was like, I can't believe this. And she's like, oh, I held on to the boat most of the time. Bill, come on. But she said, you know, you can't write about the South without writing about family and religion. And I really bristled at this because I'm like, well, screw my sisters. And, you know, I'm not going to write about religion. And that's exactly what I ended up writing about, because it is, I mean, and not just the South, but like American culture, even non-religious people are aware of it. I mean, it's kind of in our blood. And so those are things that I enjoy. And I love, and after I wrote Pretty Girls, which I really enjoyed, I wrote The Good Daughter. And I thought, God, are people going to want to say, like, oh, why another sister novel? And then I'm like, well, nobody's giving Jodi Picoult crap, so I'm just going to keep doing it. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. I want to say, first of all, if you ever get tired of writing, you are one hilarious stand-up comedian.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for what you said about the books getting into children in certain areas in the inner city. It is so crucial. I just ran into a young lady that I've been with this library for 35 years, and I ran into a young girl. Her and her brother, her mom would bring them to the library, and today she's one of the featured authors. So.
Wonderful.
It says so much. One of the main things it says, it's time for me to retire. But I thank you, I love you. And I want to know, do you have any input? Or you like, do they come to you with Netflix and say, hey, talk with you about any of the Will Trent? Because I love that book. I love the series.
Well, so Netflix did pieces of her, and ABC does, and Hulu do Will Trent. And, you know, it's really hard to, if you're someone who is a writer and you have complete control over a book. You know, I sit in my pajamas all day, and it's just what I write is what happens. And, you know, you cannot imagine the sound my asshole made when I read the first script for Will Trent. I was like, no. But, you know, I think they really capture the spirit of the characters, and they understand what I'm trying to do. The producer, the woman who is the head of production, is just amazing, and she's read all the books. And I talked to her many years ago. The books weren't even available to option, and I was frankly not going to do it because I just thought, I'm not finding the right person. And we had dinner in Atlanta, and she said, "Can you tell me why Jeffrey cheated on Sarah?" And I thought, this is someone who gets what I'm doing, because she's really thinking about it. And so I'm pleased with what they're doing. I'm pleased with the casting. I think, you know, Ramon Rodriguez is extremely sexy. And he really gets that character, and I can't wait for them to see how they're going to bring Sarah in. I mean, but the book is the book, and the show is the show, so they're different, but I love what they're doing. I love it.
Well, there went my question. I teach English, and so I love teaching Flannery O'Connor. I was a weird kid, too. I grew up in the library. My world was what I could read. And when you read that quote, I was just propelled right back to teaching that and having my students go, because she is so weird. And, you know, in dealing with the trouble of what she's writing about and the way she writes about it and using the N-word and all of that. And now I'm teaching freshmen again in a very, shall I say, closed community. They were banning books. Our librarian they couldn't fire her because she was very outspoken about banning books. And so this is my first year there, and I was hesitant to take that job. So the fact that writers are out saying, no, this has got to stop, I really appreciate everything that you do. And like I said, that creativity versus what they're doing on television, because I love your Will Trent in the books. And when I watched the show, I was like, oh, so is there going to be an HBO version?
I don't think so. I appreciate that. But here's the thing. To be a teacher is not easy. I mean, every person I know with a child, this person is taking your kid off your hands for hours every day. One, you should be grateful. But teachers are incredibly well educated. Librarians, look up what it takes to get a degree in library sciences. They run a business. They are doing fundraising. They're writing grants. They are serving the community. They're doing English as a second language. They're helping people figure out their taxes. They're dealing with the old guy complaining the paper's not here, right? This is a very, very highly educated person who is doing this job. And we need to respect these people for their expertise. And I understand if you don't want your child to read a certain book or whatever, you can option out, you know? And homeschooling is a wonderful option. But you can option out of that, and they'll find something else. But you should not have the right to deprive every other child of that. And that's why I say it's so important to stand up for that.
First of all, I was so excited to see that you were going to be here on my birthday, so I had to
come. Happy birthday. Yeah.
Thank you. I was one of those kids that reading as a child was my escape. It was my safe place. So you have become one of my favorite authors. What would you advise to authors today? What kind of advice would you give?
Well, first, there's two pieces of advice I give. Well, I should say three. Don't listen to me. Because every author's different. When I did an event with Sue Monk Kidd before The Secret Life of Bees came out, and I was like, that bee book, nobody's going to read that. Who cares? I did another event with Dan Brown. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen, buddy. Maybe you want to keep teaching at that college. I was talking to Gillian Flynn. I think you guys may know her. She's not allowed to come back here because of the restraining order, but Like, I remember this very clearly. So I was talking to Catherine Stockett about, so Kitty's like a literary author, so she's like, oh, the arc of the character, blah, yeah. And she's like, Gillian's so brave. She was writing a book, and she was almost finished, and she decided, I'm not going to write that one. I'm going to write something else. And I was like, texting, what the hell are you doing? You need to deliver that. Wait. And it was Gone Girl. So don't listen to me is my number one piece of advice, because I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I do know about work, because that is something that was instilled in me from a very young age. And I remember when I graduated high school, my dad sat me down, and he was so proud of me, and he said, baby, you can do anything you want, anything in the world, but you cannot live here. And so I had to get a job. He was like, you got a month. So I had to get a job. So the best advice I can give anyone who wants to be a writer is do the work. It's very easy to come up with an idea. Everybody in this room might have a great idea for a book. Sitting down, expressing it through character, figuring out when you're stuck, trying to find different ways to talk about different, events in the characters' lives, making them likable or unlikable, having that comes with work. There are naturally gifted people, but you will never be able to have that happen unless you sit down and do it. And that sounds really simple, but it's the hardest thing to do as a writer, is to find that time and space to sit and treat it like a job. Because you want a job as a writer. You wouldn't say, I want a job as a teacher, so I'm just going to say, hey, I want to be a teacher and see if anybody hires me. I mean, they'll do it in Florida. But, you have to have an education. You have to do the work, and it's the same with writing. So that's my best advice. The third piece of advice is read. Because a lot of writers, and I don't blame you, you read some books, you're like, how did this jackass get published, right? Learn from it. Why did they get published? What would you do differently? How would you tell your story? That's a very important thing to do. So happy birthday, and hopefully next year you'll be out there selling your book. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for coming. I usually drive hours to get to you, so thanks for coming to Kansas City, first of all. I was going to ask you about Holy Moly. Did you contact them? Did they contact you? Yeah. And is it because it was golf, or are you going to be on another one?
No.
Show anytime
so
soon?
I had so Holy Moly is a television show on ABC, and it is extreme mini golf. And I watched the first season, and I was like, that looks like fun. And I said that to my publicist, and she's like, I will get you on that show. And I'm like, okay, whatever. And then she got me on the show. And the first year was hilarious, because you have to do some weird thing, and then you have to putt, right, on mini golf. And the second year, they were trying to kill people. And I remember getting there, and it's in the desert, which is very cold at night, which they don't tell you. And they're like, this is the hole you're going to be on. And I'm looking at the hole. It's right here. And I'm thinking, well, that's not bad. And they're like, oh, but gophers pop up. So you got to putt around these gophers. I'm like, okay, that's no big deal. And they said, but in order to figure out what position you will be in against the person you're playing, you have to go on that. And I was like, and it was a 20-foot high bouncy mountain with a bucking gopher on top. And they had to crane me up there. So I'm on a crane being lifted into the air because I'm not a quitter. But I was like, girl, you are too old for this shit. I mean, it was just, that was my midlife. That was it. My father's health was not good that year. It was right at the pandemic. I had lost my mind. I was going on that show. My midlife crisis, I bought a Porsche, which I hated, because you have to pay attention when you drive one of those. And it culminated in this, and I was like, midlife crisis over. So I had to hold on to this bouncing gopher, like a bucking bronco, right? And it threw me down this mountain, and I was like, geek, 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 geek. And then I had to putt, and the whole time I'm like, don't make this putt, man. Don't make this putt, because you have to go to the next one. And the guy, in the next one, the guy who, because he beat me, thank God, but he ended up going to the obstacle course that had a bunch of portalets, and the door would open if you didn't go fast enough, and it would knock you into water. And I was in the tent when a girl had been thrown into the water, and it was so cold. She said, I forgot how to swim. They had to, like, rescue her. And somebody got a concussion from the windmills hitting him in the head. And this other guy who was, like, he was so into mini golf. He just loved mini golf. And he did a blog where he rated mini golf courses. I mean, it was just his life. And he had gone on the gopher and he twisted his knee. And I'm like, man, you are my age. That is not going to heal. You do not need it. You cannot go back. And he's like, no, I got to go back and go. I was like, you are not going to win this money. And he didn't win the money. But that was the last time I will ever do anything that crazy. I will say I've sold 40 million books. I've got the Netflix show was like #1, and Will Trent is amazing. And on IMDb, it says known for holy moly. So I think we can end on that note. You can see it on Hulu, second season. Thank you all so much.
I kind of have a wild idea.